Good afternoon. I have the pleasure to sit again with His Eminence Archbishop Lazar Puhalo, who is the founder and the abbot of the All Saints Orthodox Monastery in British Columbia, here in Canada. Good afternoon, Your Eminence.
Good afternoon.
How are you doing on this bright, sunny fall Sunday here at the monastery?
Well, we had a lovely dinner today and celebrated a few birthdays during the agape meal. So it's very nice today.
Wonderful. Today you suggested we discuss around a question that one of someone from your audience asked, why the Romans persecute Jesus, persecute the Christians.
Yeah.
And I was recently reading the book by the Yale scholar Paula Frederickson about early Christianity, and she mentioned that the Romans would often put to death in a very vivid manner, like a crucifixion, individuals who had raised popularity, were becoming popular and threatening the social order, and typically that death was the end of the threat, was the end of the movement. The followers were dispersed. In other words, there was not only Jesus around that time of uncertainty who were kind of fomenting social troubles and challenging the Roman order. The difference with Jesus, obviously, is that his followers claimed that he didn't die, so they had the problem on their hand. The usual solution didn't work. What is your understanding of why the Romans put to death Jesus and the context
Jesus was charged with insurrection, and the Romans considered him seditious. Now, we have the scriptural account of why the Jewish leaders, not the Jews in general, but why the Jewish leaders, the temple Jews, the priest and high priest, were especially interested in having Jesus put out of the way, because he was challenging their lives and understandings of the Tanakh, of the Torah. But the Romans, of course, Jesus had been charged with sedition by the Caiaphas clan, which was sort of a temple mafia. They used the temple, as a sort of piggy bank for the clan. There were 5 members of that clan in a row who were high priests, and they were siphoning off quite a bit of money from it. But they wanted to get rid of the problem, so they accused him of sedition. And when he was called a king, that, of course, was a seditious title. So they claimed that he said he was a king and he had a kingdom. And they didn't convey anything spiritual about it. So to have a kingdom within the Roman Empire without the emperor's permission was seditious. And so sedition was the charge as far as the Romans were concerned. But as to why the Christians were persecuted later, in the first place, you could have a dozen religions in the pagan world. You could worship Isis and Zeus, or Mercury, or Athena, or even Mithras, and that was okay as long as you offered sacrifice and honored the state gods, the national gods, because they really held that when you offended the national gods or didn't honor and make their sacrifices, that we would endanger the state, because the state was protected by the gods, as long as you satisfied and pleased the gods. And since Christians refused to honor the pagan gods, and refused to make sacrifice to them, including to the divine emperor, you're seditious. You're causing the gods to be angered with the state and endangering the state. And because Christianity appeared to be clandestine as well, you weren't sure what was going on in their meetings and gatherings. So there was a rumor about them being seditious. Sometimes the persecution wasn't by the government, it was by the local populace. Because when you're clandestine like that, there are all kinds of rumors and gossip about you. So in some places, the locals actually believed that the Christians sacrificed a child and ate the child in some kind of a feast, because they understood that Christians said they were receiving the body and blood of Christ in the Holy Communion. That to them, the Christians are practicing cannibalism. So the locals were very upset by that. But they also, when Pliny was in Asia Minor complaining about the Christians, one of the problems was, he said that the Christians look after the poor and the needy and those who are sick. And so the emperor had asked, well, who's poor and sick are they looking after, mine or their own? And Pliny said, well, they look after everybody without distinction. They'll look after anybody who's poor, anybody who needs help, anybody who needs medical care. The Christians will look after them without any distinction in who they are. And so that was considered seditious also, because at that time the state would look after certain people, and the groups, like you had a carpenters group, a steelworkers group, a sword makers group, whatever. That institution, that group was responsible for its own. That craft lodge was responsible for its own people, and the Christians were looking after everybody without regard to who they were. But the main issue was that they were dishonoring the state gods. And if you didn't mollify the state gods, there was no theology involved. But they expected reverence and sacrifice. And that was the way of honoring them. If you weren't participating in that, you were endangering the empire, you were endangering the state by the gods would punish the state, punish the whole nation.
And Paula Fredriksen even mentioned that each city has its own gods, so the city itself would become worried because its own city god would get upset, probably.
Right.
But if the Romans went after Jesus and persecuted him because of his title as king of...
Let's say they didn't persecute Jesus.
Or the persecution.
Christians.
And went after Jesus and persecuted the Christians because he was called the king. What was the role of the temple Jews then? That would have been enough to put him on the cross.
That's a little bit of a stretch. The Romans did not persecute Christians because of Jesus saying he was king.
So the death of Jesus was because...
They didn't persecute him because of the death of Jesus.
Sorry, they put to death Jesus because he claimed to be the king?
Well, that was something very local. That was just with Pontius Pilate. Rome itself hadn't ever even heard of Jesus, didn't know who he was. But the Christians were seen as seditious. Because they were clandestine, they would worship in secret and hidden, and they wouldn't offer sacrifices to the city gods, the provincial gods, the town gods, the gods of the nation. So they therefore endangered the city, because the city's welfare was based on its doing proper honor to the gods.
And so for Pontius Pilate, um, the sedition and the reason to put Jesus on the cross was that he was called a king, and you could not be called a king from what my understanding. What was the role of the temple Jews then, if this was enough to stop him?
No, they actually, we don't know all the details, of course, because we don't have privy to what actually was back and forth said. But we know that when Jesus was talked about his kingdom, the kingdom of heaven, he was talking about a kingdom, and as far as the Romans were concerned, I mean, now we're only talking about Pontius Pilate and people in Palestine. Rome didn't know anything about Jesus. The idea that there was a kingdom rising up in the midst of the empire, which would sort of be contrary to the empire and challenge the empire. They wouldn't. The Romans in Palestine, the Roman government in Palestine, would not have understood the spiritual dimension of it. Only the Jews would have understood the spiritual dimension of it. But as far as Romans were concerned, this was a political movement. And the high priest and the Caiaphas group, I keep referring to the Caiaphas group because that family was using the temple as a private piggy bank. But they had a vested interest in silencing Jesus, especially after he purged the temple, because that impacted on people's personal wealth and income. So they're the ones who arrested Jesus, then passed him on to Pilate with charges against him. You know, he says he's a king, he's come about a kingdom. So that was sedition. And sedition, of course, would be against the state in such a way that crucifixion was almost certain that it. You know, when people talk about two thieves on the cross of Christ, that's not feasible. They wouldn't have been crucified just because they were thieves. There had to be a bigger, something bigger than that about them. And I'd say probably brigands would be a better description of them. But anyway, as far as you know, put aside Jesus, because people in Gaul, people in Rome knew nothing of Jesus. But the Christians themselves, they felt, and this is something that you can see a shade of it in the Christian nationalism in America too, because you didn't honor and sacrifice to the gods. You were endangering the nation. You're endangering the city you lived in, or the state, because the beneficence of the gods is what kept the empire intact and kept it strong and growing. So failure to honor those gods would be to turn them. They might do something terrible to the city or to the state, just vindictively or out of punishment, because they weren't honored properly or because sacrifice wasn't given properly.
So I would like to double click on the kingdom aspect. If Jesus had not used the term "my kingdom," the temple Jews would have had a harder time to convince Pontius Pilate, that he was a threat?
Well, we have no idea. There's no way we could possibly know that.
Mm-hmm.
See,
but
the thing is that he was an itinerant preacher wandering around the countryside with followings and stirring up people to something or the other. So he would have been under, the Romans would have been watching him very carefully anyway. And they would have been looking to see if something was wrong. Because here's a man who's gathered a following. Now, following in the Roman Empire was dangerous for an individual to have a following like that. So was Jesus trying to stir up a rebellion, a revolution? Was he trying to get the Jews to take up arms against Rome? What was the story here? They didn't know. but they were watching, and the leaders, the leaders of the temple, so far as we know, the leaders of the temple were anxious to get Jesus out of the way because he was what he was teaching about the temple, and there's a lot more to this than. But now we'll have to put that Jesus aside because the Romans knew nothing about Jesus. Neither the people of Gaul knew nothing about Jesus. So he wasn't the issue. He wasn't the issue at all. The issue was that Christians would not honor the state gods. Therefore, they might be endangering the state or endangering the city they were in. And since they were clandestine, they might also have been some kind of a seditious group. There was no problem about them being Christians and Mithraeus and worshippers of Isis and worship all together at the same time, because pantheism was what the religion of the day was all about. So they could have been pantheists, would have been fine, as long as they offered sacrifice to the national gods and the city and state gods, the city and provincial gods. They were persecuted because they were thought to be endangering the welfare of the state by refusing to honor the state gods.
And that lasted, that brutal, uncompromising, on both sides, uncompromising on the side of the Christian who refused to bow to other gods, and on the side of the Romans who, when they would find them, they would pick them up and kill them. That lasted for 300 years, at least without.
Well, it was on and off, on and off. It wasn't constant, it wasn't steady. Diocletian had one, called the Diocletian persecutions, were not necessarily the Nero persecutions, but the main factor, and the reason why we see this in Christian nationalism today, is because what is coming clearly from the Christian nationalists is if you don't honor our God the way we think you should, you're endangering the nation. God will punish the nation because not everybody thinks as we think, because not everybody believes as we believe. And so to them, atheism isn't just it's people who don't believe in God. Atheism is certainly not a religion. It's idiotic and stupid to call it a religion. It's the absence of religion altogether, the absence of belief. It's just sheer stupidity to call it a religion. But anyway, these fanatical Christian nationalists imagine that if people don't worship their God, don't worship Christ, that God will do something horrible to the nation. It's people who had an abortion cause earthquakes, and people who are drag queens, like the Vice President of the United States is, will cause hurricanes. Tornadoes happen because somebody irritates God or displeases God. They don't happen because it's a natural phenomenon that's occurred since the beginning of time. They occur because somebody irritated God. And God is always ready and willing to do horrible things to people and punish people, even the innocent. Hurricanes don't go around and pick off people that are considered sinners. It kills everybody but without discretion. So God will wipe out millions of innocent people because of the sins of two or three in the state. That is the attitude of Christian nationalists. But it's the same attitude that the Romans had for persecuting the Christians in the first place. Is your failure to properly venerate the national God will endanger the nation. And that, unfortunately, they're turning Christianity or Christ into a national deity instead of the Savior and Redeemer of the world, they're turning him into a national deity in a purely pagan manner. That, if you look carefully and try to study everything that's being taught in the evangelical world, the evangelicals are just neo-pagans. And they paganized Christ and they paganized the idea of God.
But what's your response to those Christians who say, well, we simply want to live in a Christian society with Christian values, with leaders who share our Christian values. We accept other religions and other faiths, but they cannot be on the driver's seat. They can be on the passenger seat, but not on the driver's seat. We simply want to have our leader to espouse the same values.
That really isn't true. I mean, you've got a felon, a rapist, and a child sex abuser as president of the United States. If that's what Christianity stands for in the States, then God should wipe the whole thing out.
Yeah.
If he's the exemplar of evangelical Christianity, a rapist and a person who trafficked children for sex.
Well, some of the American Christian voters for President Trump, they would tell you, well, throughout Israel history, throughout the Hebrews history, you had leaders who were not the best representatives, though, however favorable they were to the faith. Like King David was not themselves a paragon of in that Bible time. It was Hebrew values. So yes, Trump might be a flawed leader, but
he's not a flawed leader. He's a rapist and a criminal. Mm-hmm. He's a sex abuser of children. That is not a flawed character. Mm-hmm. That is a psychopath. Mm-hmm. That's not a flawed character. Mm-hmm. Now, the fact that David was king, he wasn't elected by the people. Mm-hmm. He was the king. You've got a man who's a sexual monster running the United States and is turning it into a fascist state, very clearly, without any shadow of doubt. And that is the representation of what evangelical Christianity is today. Let's go back and look at how many evangelical moralist priests, like the one who was just sentenced for sexually abusing a 12-year-old girl, systematically over several years. This is a megachurch pastor, evangelical megachurch pastor. That is the morality of the evangelical church. Mm. That is the morality of the evangelical church.
Would you say that this would be...
And they think as long as you give the proper sacrifice, by whatever definition you give it, to a national state God, he'll favor the state and nation, no matter what sins you commit, no matter what horrific deeds you do, no matter how many of your pastors rape little children or sexually abuse 12-year-old girls. Mm-hmm. As long as you're offering the proper sacrifice to him, he'll protect the state. But if you don't offer the proper sacrifice, it'll cause... Hurricanes were unheard of, weren't they, before somebody irritated God, right? Well, tornadoes were unheard of before somebody irritated God. There were no earthquakes before there was prostitution. They're all caused by people who irritate God.
Mm. Well, they would say, or they might say, well, you can't condemn the group for the action of a few bad apples here, that not all evangelical leaders are child molesters.
And not all gay people are child molesters. Most of the people
right.
who abuse children are not homosexual.
So saying that they
represent... what they're saying is that a few bad apples will cause God to punish America. That's exactly what they're saying.
Right.
But so don't tell me that a few bad apples don't represent the evangelical church, because a few bad apples don't represent the United States of America either. And God is not going to punish the nation for a few bad apples. They're going to punish themselves. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, you can't say, as Apostle Paul once condemned and say, let us do evil that good might result. Let us elect a man who's destroying the Constitution of the United States, who's clearly forming a fascist state, who have no qualms about the fact that he sexually abused underage girls, that he helped in the trafficking of these girls with the modeling agencies that he ran, carrying girls internationally, that he raped a woman in a public place, and that he was having sex with a prostitute while his wife was giving birth to his baby. He was guilty of 57 counts of felonies. He was constantly violating the American law, constantly violating the American Constitution. Now, you can't compare that to some king who was, because he wasn't elected by the people, and there was no Constitution. David wasn't violating any kind of Constitution, but he was still the apple of God's eye because he repented, and he repented indeed and tried to change himself. So I mean, that's the whole thing. But this idea that God is going to punish America because some people don't properly make sacrifice to God or don't worship Him in the proper fashion, and some people are atheists, and you know that we've gone through the whole of history with these countries seeing all of these negative aspects played out, and especially in Rome, all the pagan gods, and God didn't punish the nation.
Right, and
in all the past, God didn't punish the nation.
Right, and then that persecution that you mentioned until I guess until Constantine in 312 in our era moved to the other, not to the other, but moved radically toward
extreme.
the.
But don't
I don't know
you
if
see
it's
the point? Christians were the cause of the downfall of Rome, according to the Romans.
They were or they were not. Sorry.
They were cause of the downfall of Rome because they didn't sacrifice to the state gods.
Until they became the state religion, where
well, when they became the state religion, but then Rome fell.
2
pagan
centuries
Rome
after.
didn't fall. Christian Rome fell.
Mm-hmm.
Not pagan Rome. Christian Rome fell. So what were the pagans to think but that Rome fell because the Christians wouldn't offer sacrifice to the gods?
Well, by now there is a consensus that there were many demographic, economic, fiscal, military reasons for the downfall of Rome, not its switch to a religion.
That doesn't matter. If God was protecting the nation, none of that would have mattered.
So how do you see?
If they had been sacrificing, in the Roman thought, if they had still been sacrificing to the gods, none of that would have happened. If God had been protecting Rome because of the Christians, none of that would have happened.
Right. If God, so according to the Christian nationalist view, if the Roman Empire should have thrived, not declined, once when Christianity became the state religion, is that you're right? So the conversion of Constantine and the switch to exclusively a Christian religion is and the subsequent fall of Rome is actually a proof that Christian it's a way of showing that Christian nationalism doesn't work.
Doesn't work. No.
Is that
no? It just simply doesn't work. And the thing is that you have to say, now let's go back to why did the Romans persecute the Christians? Because they weren't sacrificing and honoring the national gods. Pagan Rome did not fall. Christian Rome fell. And in the minds of the pagan Romans, it fell because the Christians were not honoring the state gods. So
can you explain, sorry, what do you mean by pagan Rome didn't fail, Christian Rome fell?
No, Rome was already Christian when it fell.
Right, so what?
So the pagan Romans would naturally say that's because the Christians took over and were no longer honoring the state gods. So the gods turned their back on Rome and it fell. See, that we've gone about these things from a kind of a mythological point of view. I mean, Constantine finally did die, an Arian. He was baptized an Arian, but then Christianity began to take over, and we'd have to follow the history of it afterwards. You know that eventually Protestants would say that all these catastrophes were happening because of Rome, the Roman Catholics, and for that in America they used to have a publication the Baptists put out called the converted Catholic. They were converting Catholics to Christianity because in their view, the Catholics were absolutely not Christians. And in the view of still groups of Protestants in America and elsewhere probably would say that Roman Catholics are not Christians.
Right, but there were nonetheless material improvement and benefits of Constantine conversion. The bloodshed and the persecution of the faithful stopped.
Well, the persecution wasn't that intense at that time anyway. The persecution was periodic. It wasn't constant or continuous. And sometimes it's even exaggerated to a degree. I mean, if one wants to have some integrity in looking at history, the degree of the persecution is exaggerated in the first place. And secondly, it was only sporadic, it wasn't constant.
So it could have continued on under the statu quo that was
might
Constantine.
not. I mean, some of the emperors didn't see any reason for persecuting Christians. It wasn't persecuted under every emperor.
So it's not clear in your view that there is a net benefit of Christianity becoming the state religion in 312?
Well, I'm saying that the pagan Romans couldn't see any benefit because Rome fell apart after it became Christian. It didn't follow, and in the mind of the pagan Romans, it fell apart because the Christians weren't offering sacrifice to the state gods. And the problem here is with state gods or state religions. When you have state religions, did God actually destroy the Spanish Armada because he liked Anglicans better than Catholics? Mm-hmm. Really? And in the 100 Years' War, which was a war between Christians, which ones did God favor and which ones did he not favor? So now you're saying, because we have a state religion, if our state loses to another state that has a different state religion, obviously their God is stronger than our God. Mm-hmm. So now you're dividing God up by various states. Was God an Anglican or was he a Roman Catholic?
Which would be even more problematic if it's the same religion.
If it's supposedly the same religion, but it still comes down to, was God a Lutheran? Was he a Roman Catholic?
Right.
Was he an Anglican?
Yeah.
Because they killed each other in horrendous bloodshed over a full 100 years to see which God was stronger.
Yeah.
The Protestant God or the Catholic God.
Yeah.
Or the Calvinist God or the Lutheran God.
Yeah.
See, so you divided God up into particles by making state gods, state religions. And that's why the founders, the authors of the American Declaration and Constitution, were adamant about not having a state religion.
They kind of followed in that line of reasoning that you mentioned.
Because some of the Christians in Britain had been persecuted by the Anglicans and fled to America because they were persecuted by the state religion. Mm-hmm. And that happened, some of the Europeans came for the same reason. They were but the state religion was Christian. Mm-hmm. And the Christians were intent on killing other Christians. And the Christians and having the state religion as Lutheran, then Calvinists are heretics and should be put to death. John Hus was killed. Okay, why? His God wasn't as strong as the Catholic God. That's the whole point. What you're seeing here is they're making, when you make a state God, if your state falls, then it means your God was weaker than the God of the state that conquered you. So you're dividing God against himself in your own mind. You see, and it will hopefully not come to pass, but if one particular version of Christianity becomes dominant in America under a fascist regime, as it is now, they're going to start persecuting other Christians because they're not the right kind of Christians. And they're going to be dividing Christ against himself. I mean, is the Southern Baptist Christ stronger than the Catholic Christ? You know, is the Lutheran Christ stronger than the Methodist Christ? So which Christ is correct? Which version of Christ is correct? Which version of God is correct? Is there a fiery hell beneath the earth someplace, even though the Orthodox Christian Church has no such doctrine? So therefore the Orthodox are not actually Christians according to evangelicals, because we don't have a hell like they have. So you're dividing constantly. When you make a state church, the state church is going to persecute all other versions of the same religion. And they're going to divide Christ against himself and God against himself.
Thank you.
Our God is stronger than your God.
Thank you, Your Eminence.
Yeah.